On the morning of October 14th, 1891, in a windswept corner of Dakota Territory that the government had barely bothered to name, a Norwegian immigrant named Bjorn Halvorsen began digging. His neighbors watched from their porches, shaking their heads as the hole grew deeper and wider, a dark wound in the frozen earth. "What is that fool doing now?" Lars Thorvaldsen asked his wife Martha. "Digging his own grave before winter even starts?" But Bjorn kept digging, and when his 8-year-old son Magnus asked why they were burying the smokehouse, Bjorn knelt down and said something his grandmother had told him 50 years before in a village called Alesund. And if you want to find out what happened when the worst winter in Dakota history arrived, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Bjorn Halvorsen was born in the summer of 1857 in a fishing village on the western coast of Norway, where the mountains dropped straight into the sea, and the winters lasted 9 months of the year. His father, Harold, was a fisherman like his father before him, and his father before that. 7 generations of Halvorsens pulling cod from the cold gray waters of the Norwegian Sea. The family lived in a small wooden house built into the hillside above the harbor. In the summer, the sun barely set. In the winter, it barely rose, and in between, there was work. Endless back-breaking work that made the difference between eating and starving. Bjorn was the third of 6 children and the only one who survived past childhood. Scarlet fever took 2 brothers before Bjorn was old enough to remember their faces. A sister drowned when the family fishing boat capsized in a sudden storm. The youngest, a boy named Eric, simply failed to wake up one winter morning. The cold had slipped into his small body like a thief in the night. By the time Bjorn was 15, he understood something that many people never learn. Survival is not guaranteed. It must be earned every single day. This understanding shaped everything he did from then on. While other boys his age dreamed of adventure and glory, Bjorn studied the ways of survival. He learned which plants could be eaten in an emergency and which would kill you. He memorized the patterns of the weather, the smell of the air before a storm, the color of the sky at sunset, the behavior of the birds and fish that seemed to know things humans had forgotten. He spent hours with the old men of the village listening to their stories of winters past. The great blizzard of 1837, the famine of 1842, the freeze of 1861 that killed the fish in the fjord itself. Each story contained lessons. Each tragedy had survivors, and Bjorn studied what they had done differently. But his greatest teacher was his grandmother. His grandmother, Sigrid Halvorsen, was the oldest person in the village. She had been born in 1804 during the Napoleonic Wars, when Norway was still under Danish rule and the world was a very different place. She had seen famines and plagues and wars. She had buried 3 husbands and 11 of her 13 children. And she had learned in the hard school of experience every trick that the old people knew about staying alive when the world wanted you dead. "Bjorn," she would say, her voice creaking like an old ship in a storm, "the earth is a blanket. Never forget this. No matter how cold the air becomes, 6 feet down, the soil remembers summer. The earth wants to keep you warm. You just have to know how to ask." Bjorn didn't understand what she meant until the winter he was 16. That year, a blizzard came down from the Arctic that buried their village under 15 feet of snow. The temperature dropped so low that the fish froze solid, before they could be carried from the boats to the drying racks. 3 families in the village died when their fuel ran out, and they couldn't dig themselves free to find more. But Sigrid's house stayed warm. She had built her smokehouse differently from everyone else's, not above ground, but below it. A tunnel ran from her cabin to an underground chamber where she smoked fish and meat. And in that tunnel, something remarkable happened. The heat from the smoking fire didn't escape into the cold air above. Instead, it rose slowly through the earth, warming the ground beneath her cabin floor. While her neighbors burned through their entire winter's supply of firewood in a single week, Sigrid used barely a quarter of her stockpile. The warmth rising from her underground smokehouse provided most of what her cabin needed to stay above freezing. "The fire doesn't fight the cold," she explained to Bjorn. "The earth fights it for you. You just have to put the fire where the earth can use it." Bjorn never forgot those words. In 1883, when Bjorn was 26 years old, a letter arrived from America. His cousin Olaf had emigrated 3 years earlier, claiming land under something called the Homestead Act. 160 acres, the letter said. Free land if you work it for 5 years. The soil is black and rich. The prairie goes on forever. Come to Dakota. Bring your wife. Make a new life. Bjorn had married Ingrid Larsen 2 years earlier. She was the daughter of another fishing family, tall and strong and capable, with clear blue eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. She had given him a son, Magnus, and was carrying their second child when the letter arrived. They sold everything they owned, the fishing boat, the nets, the small house that had belonged to Bjorn's father, and bought 2 tickets in steerage class on a steamship bound for New York. The crossing took 19 days. Ingrid gave birth to their daughter Astrid, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in a cargo hold that smelled of livestock and unwashed bodies. The ship's doctor said it was a miracle both mother and child survived. Ingrid said it was stubbornness. From New York, they took a train west. Bjorn spoke almost no English. Ingrid spoke even less. They navigated by pointing at maps and saying the word Dakota until someone pointed them in the right direction. Cousin Olaf met them at the train station in Bismarck. He had aged a decade in the 3 years since he left Norway. His hands were rough and cracked. His back was bent from work. But he was grinning, and when he embraced Bjorn, he whispered, "This is the hardest thing you'll ever do, and it's worth every minute of it." The land Bjorn claimed was 40 miles from the nearest town, on a stretch of prairie so flat that you could see the curvature of the earth if you looked hard enough. There were no trees, except along the creek that ran through the southeast corner of his property. No hills to break the wind, no shelter of any kind. He built his cabin in the summer of 1884, working from dawn until after dark, digging the foundation by hand, cutting sod for the roof, fitting the logs together like puzzle pieces. Ingrid gathered buffalo chips for fuel and wild vegetables for food. Magnus, just 3 years old, learned to stay out of the way of swinging axes and falling timber. That first winter, they nearly died. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero in December and stayed there for 6 weeks. The wind never stopped. The snow drifted so high against the cabin walls that Bjorn had to dig a tunnel just to reach the woodpile. They burned everything they could find, logs, furniture, dried buffalo dung, even some of the lumber Bjorn had saved for expanding the cabin in spring. By February, Ingrid was so weak from cold and hunger that she couldn't get out of bed. Magnus developed a cough that sounded like rocks in a bucket. Baby Astrid cried constantly, her small body never quite warm enough, no matter how many blankets they piled on her. Bjorn lay awake at night, listening to the wind, and remembered his grandmother's words. The earth is a blanket. 6 feet down, the soil remembers summer. But he was too exhausted to do anything about it, too cold, too hungry, too beaten down by a land that seemed determined to kill his family. They survived that winter by the thinnest of margins. When spring finally came, Bjorn counted their remaining supplies. 3 days of food, half a cord of wood, and a determination that burned hotter than any fire. "Never again," he told Ingrid. "I will never watch my family freeze again." Over the next 6 years, Bjorn established himself as one of the more successful homesteaders in the region. His cattle thrived. His crops grew. He expanded the cabin, built a barn, dug a well that produced clean, cold water even in the driest summers. But every winter, the same problem returned. Firewood. There simply wasn't enough of it. The few trees along the creek couldn't provide more than a fraction of what the family needed, and hauling lumber from town cost more money than Bjorn could spare. He tried everything. He built a more efficient stove. He stuffed the cabin walls with dried grass for insulation. He even experimented with burning dried corn cobs and sunflower stalks. Nothing worked well enough. Every winter was still a battle against the cold, a desperate scramble to keep the fire burning and the family alive. Then, in the summer of 1891, Bjorn's neighbor, Wilhelm Ostberg, announced that he was giving up. The cold had broken him. His wife had developed consumption from years of living in a damp, poorly heated cabin. His youngest son had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. "This land doesn't want us here," Wilhelm said, loading his wagon with the remnants of 7 years of labor. "I'm going back to Minnesota. At least there are trees there." Bjorn helped Wilhelm load his wagon and shook his hand when he left. But as he walked back to his own cabin, he found himself thinking about his grandmother again, about the tunnel under her smokehouse, about the heat rising from the earth. "The fire doesn't fight the cold," she had said. "The earth fights it for you." That night, Bjorn couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Ingrid, staring at the ceiling, doing calculations in his head. The constant temperature of the earth at 6 feet deep, approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat output of a small smoking fire, 15,000 BTUs per hour. The heat loss through a log cabin wall in winter, 8,000 BTUs per hour. The math worked. It actually worked. If he could capture the heat from a small underground fire, not a roaring blaze, just a steady smolder for smoking meat, and channel that warmth into his cabin through the earth itself, he might be able to cut his firewood consumption by half, maybe more. In the morning, he told Ingrid his plan. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "How deep do you need to dig?" 6 feet to start, then horizontal, maybe 50 feet total. "That's a lot of digging." "Yes. You'll need help." "Magnus is old enough." Ingrid nodded slowly. "Then dig? And Bjorn?" "Yes. Don't die in that hole." He started on October 14th. The ground wasn't frozen yet, but it was hard, packed clay and glacial, till that fought back against every thrust of his shovel. Every inch of progress required dozens of strikes with the pickaxe, then careful removal with the shovel, then a pause to catch his breath and wipe the sweat from his eyes. Magnus helped when he could, carrying the loosened dirt away in a wooden bucket. The boy was 8 years old now, small for his age, but strong from years of farm work. He didn't complain, didn't ask for breaks, just kept hauling bucket after bucket until his arms shook and his hands blistered. "Why are we digging so deep, Papa?" Magnus asked on the third day. "Because the earth remembers summer," Bjorn replied. "Down there, where we're going, it never gets truly cold. The ground holds on to warmth the way a mother holds on to her child." Magnus nodded solemnly, accepting this wisdom the way children do, completely, without question. Astrid, now 6 years old, brought them water and sang songs she had learned from her mother. She didn't understand what they were building, but she understood that it was important. She made up stories about the hole in the ground, that they were digging to the center of the earth, that they would find buried treasure, that they were making a home for the trolls from her bedtime stories. Ingrid watched it all with a mixture of hope and fear. She had seen her husband's determination save them before. She had also seen other men's determination destroy them. The line between genius and madness, she knew, was often visible only in hindsight. The neighbors thought he had lost his mind. "What is Halvorsen building?" Lars Thorvaldsen asked at the general store in town. "Some kind of cellar in the middle of his yard?" "Heard he's digging a tunnel," said Anders Magnusson, the blacksmith. "Maybe he's planning to escape when the Indians attack." "There haven't been Indian attacks in this area for 10 years, Lars scoffed. "Then maybe he's just crazy." Word spread through the scattered homesteads. "The Norwegian is digging a hole to nowhere. The Norwegian thinks he can burrow like a gopher. The Norwegian will freeze to death this winter, and we'll find his bones in the spring." Lars Thorvaldsen rode out to the Halvorsen homestead one morning in late October to see for himself. He found Bjorn 15 feet underground, widening the vertical shaft that would connect to the horizontal tunnel. "Halvorsen," Lars called down, "what in God's name are you doing?" Bjorn looked up. His face was streaked with dirt. His hands were bleeding through his gloves, but his eyes were calm. "Building a smokehouse." "Underground? That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard. Smoke needs to rise. Everyone knows that." "The smoke will rise through the earth into my cabin." Lars stared at him. Then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed across the empty prairie. "You've gone mad, Halvorsen. The cold has broken your brain." "Perhaps. We'll see in January." Lars rode away, shaking his head. That night he told his wife Martha about the crazy Norwegian and his underground smokehouse. Martha shook her head and said she would pray for Ingrid Halvorsen, who would surely be a widow before spring. By November 1st, the vertical shaft was complete. 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, lined with timber, Bjorn had salvaged from an abandoned homestead 3 miles east. The horizontal tunnel began at the bottom of this shaft and ran northeast, directly toward the cabin. Bjorn dug 2 feet per day, sometimes 3 if the soil was soft. The tunnel was 4 feet high, just tall enough to crawl through, and 3 feet wide. He braced the walls and ceiling with lumber as he went, creating a passage that looked like something from a coal mine. Magnus helped after school, holding the lantern while Bjorn worked, passing tools, carrying out the endless buckets of dirt. Ingrid brought food and water 3 times a day. Astrid drew pictures of the tunnel and pretended it was a cave for trolls. The work was brutal. Bjorn's shoulders screamed from the constant digging. His knees ached from crawling back and forth through the narrow passage. His lungs burned from the dust and the stale air, but every foot of progress brought him closer to the cabin and to the safety he was building for his family. On November 18th, the tunnel reached the foundation of the cabin. Bjorn spent 3 more days digging an upward shaft, creating a vent that would allow warm air to rise from the tunnel into a specially constructed chamber beneath the cabin floor. On November 21st, he began construction on the underground smokehouse itself. The chamber was 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet tall, large enough to hang dozens of fish and several sides of meat. Bjorn lined the walls with flat stones from the creek, creating a surface that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. In the center, he built a small fire pit, surrounded by a ring of larger stones that would radiate warmth in all directions. The key was the smoke tunnel. Rather than venting the smoke directly upward, where it would dissipate into the cold air and take all its heat with it, Bjorn channeled it through a horizontal passage that ran the length of the main tunnel, warming the earth as it went. Only at the far end, near the cabin, did the smoke finally rise, but by then it had given up most of its heat to the surrounding soil. The system was complete on November 29th. Bjorn lit the first fire at dawn on November 30th. The moment of truth had arrived. Bjorn knelt in his underground smokehouse chamber, surrounded by stone walls and hanging meat, feeling like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. Everything he had worked for over the past 6 weeks came down to this single moment. Either his grandmother's wisdom would prove true, or he had wasted precious time that should have been spent gathering more firewood. Ingrid stood at the tunnel entrance watching. The children were inside the cabin waiting. The neighbors, Bjorn was certain, were watching from their own homes, expecting failure. He struck the match. The kindling caught immediately, dry birch bark and shredded paper that he'd been saving for just this purpose. The flames spread to the small logs arranged in the fire pit, licking at the wood, growing stronger by the second. Smoke began to rise. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of rushing upward and dissipating into the cold air, as it would have done in an above-ground smokehouse, the smoke moved slowly, almost leisurely, following the path Bjorn had designed. It curled through the horizontal channel, warming the stones as it passed, transferring its heat to the surrounding earth. By the time it reached the vent near the cabin, it was noticeably cooler. "Is it working?" Ingrid called from the tunnel entrance. Bjorn pressed his palm against the stone wall. It was warm, not hot, but warm, like a rock that had spent the afternoon in summer sun. "It's working," he said. "God help me, it's actually working." The smoke rose slowly, curling through the underground passages like a living thing. Bjorn had positioned himself in the cabin, his hand pressed against the floor above the vent chamber. For the first hour, he felt nothing. Then, gradually, warmth. It was subtle at first, just a faint increase in temperature barely perceptible. But by mid-afternoon, the floor above the vent was warm to the touch. By evening, the entire cabin felt different. Not hot exactly, but comfortable, stable, like the building had finally found its balance with the cold outside. That night, Bjorn built only a small fire in the cabin's regular stove, barely enough to heat a pot of coffee. But the family slept warm. The children didn't wake up shivering. Ingrid didn't have to pile blankets on top of blankets just to keep from freezing. "It's working," she whispered to Bjorn as they lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside. "I can feel it. The earth is doing most of the work now. The fire just reminds it to stay warm." "Your grandmother?" "She knew things that the rest of the world has forgotten. Maybe I'm just remembering them for her." The first real test came on December 14th. A blizzard swept down from Canada, driving temperatures to 25 below zero and piling snow against every building for miles. The wind was so strong that it stripped the bark from trees and tore shingles from roofs. The Thorvaldsen family burned 47 logs in 3 days just to keep from freezing. The Magnuson family burned everything they had and still ended up huddled together under every blanket and hide they owned. Old Mrs. Johansen, who lived alone at the edge of the settlement, was found frozen in her bed a week later. She had run out of fuel and been too proud to ask for help. The Halvorsen family burned 9 logs. 9 logs in 3 days, while their neighbors burned 40. The underground smokehouse fire never went out. Bjorn kept it fed with small amounts of wood, just enough to maintain a steady smolder. And the heat it produced rose through the earth and into the cabin like a gift from the ground itself. When the blizzard passed, Lars Thorvaldsen rode out to check on his neighbors. He expected to find the Halvorsens half frozen, maybe dead. Instead, he found them playing cards by a comfortably warm stove, the children pink-cheeked and well-fed, Ingrid knitting a sweater with fingers that showed no sign of cold damage. "How?" Lars demanded. "How are you alive?" "We didn't need much wood," Bjorn said simply. "The earth kept us warm." "That's impossible." "Come outside, I'll show you." But Lars didn't want to see. Not yet. He was too proud, too invested in his belief that Bjorn Halvorsen was a fool. He rode away without another word. January brought the true test. The month began with an unseasonable thaw. Temperatures climbing into the 20s, snow melting, spirits lifting. Some of the neighbors even suggested that maybe the winter would be mild this year, that maybe God had decided to show them mercy. Lars Thorvaldsen used the thaw to haul more firewood from town. "See?" he told his wife Martha. "The Norwegian's tunnel was a waste of time. We'll be fine with traditional heating." But Bjorn noticed something the others missed. The birds were behaving strangely, flocking together, staying close to the ground, feeding frantically as if preparing for something. The cattle were restless, pacing in their barn, refusing to go outside even when the doors were opened. "Something's coming," he told Ingrid on January 10th. "Something bad." "How do you know?" "The animals know. They always know." He spent the next 2 days making final preparations. He reinforced the tunnel walls where they had settled. He stocked extra food in the underground chamber. Dried meat, preserved vegetables, containers of water that wouldn't freeze at underground temperatures. He checked and rechecked every stone, every beam, every inch of his creation. Then on January 12, 1892, an Arctic front descended on Dakota Territory that would later be called the coldest day in history. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees below zero. 42 below, so cold that spit froze before it hit the ground, so cold that cattle died standing up in their fields, so cold that the air itself seemed to have turned to ice. People would talk about this cold for generations. Old-timers would measure all future winters against it. Scientists would study it, trying to understand how temperatures so extreme could occur outside the polar regions. The blizzard that accompanied this cold front was unlike anything the settlers had experienced. Visibility dropped to zero. Snow fell so fast and so thick that it buried entire buildings within hours. The wind was so strong that it picked up small animals and hurled them against walls like missiles. 4 families died in the first 3 days. Their names would be carved into the memorial stone that the surviving settlers would erect the following spring. Erickson, Peterson, Lindgren, O'Brien. 16 souls, including 7 children under the age of 10. The Erickson family was the first to fall. Jens Erickson had been a blacksmith in the old country, a skilled tradesman who had come to America believing that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. He had built a solid cabin, stocked what he thought was enough firewood, prepared as well as any man could. But 42 below zero laughs at preparation. On the second night of the blizzard, the Erickson family burned their last log. Jens started burning furniture, the table he had built with his own hands, the chairs that had been a wedding gift, the bed frame that had cradled all 3 of his children. By morning, the furniture was gone. He burned the wooden toys, the picture frames, the doors between rooms. Each item fed the stove for minutes at best, buying his family a few more breaths of warm air before the cold came creeping back. By noon of the 3rd day, there was nothing left to burn. Jens's wife, Marta, wrapped their children in every blanket, every piece of clothing, every scrap of fabric in the house. She held them close, singing the lullabies she had sung in Norway, trying to keep them calm as the cold seeped in. "Papa, I'm cold," their youngest, a girl of 4 named Elsa, whispered. "I know, my heart, I know." Jens Erickson died trying to reach the neighbor's cabin for help. His frozen body was found 50 yards from his door, his arms still reaching toward the Halvorsen homestead, toward the thin wisp of smoke that marked the only warm building for miles. Marta and the children were found frozen in their beds, still holding each other. The look on Marta's face, those who found them said, was almost peaceful, as if she had found comfort in knowing she wouldn't have to watch her children suffer anymore. The Erickson family, mother, father, 3 children, were found frozen in their cabin when their wood pile ran out. They had burned their furniture, their clothes, even the wooden toys the children had received for Christmas. It wasn't enough. The Peterson family tried to reach the safety of town. Their bodies were found 100 yards from their cabin, huddled together in the snow, so frozen that the men who found them couldn't separate the mother's arms from around her children. Old Anders Magnusson, the blacksmith, survived by burning his own shop to the ground, all his tools, his forge, his life's work, and sheltering in the still warm ruins until the storm passed. He never recovered from the loss. He hung himself in March. And the Thorvaldsen family? They survived. Barely. Lars burned everything they had, furniture, fence posts, the lumber he had saved to expand his barn. By the 4th day of the storm, he was burning the walls of the cabin itself, tearing boards from the inside walls to feed a fire that couldn't keep up with the cold. On the 5th day, with his wife and children huddled around a dying fire, their breath visible in the air, even inside their own home, Lars Thorvaldsen swallowed his pride and trudged through the snow to the Halvorsen homestead. He expected to find them dead. He was prepared to scavenge whatever they had left. Instead, he found them eating dinner. The cabin was warm, not hot, but warm, comfortable enough that the children were playing on the floor in their regular clothes, not bundled in every blanket the family owned. Ingrid was cooking stew on a small stove that held barely a handful of coals, and the woodpile by the door, still full, barely touched. "How?" Lars's voice cracked. "How is this possible?" Bjorn stood up from the table. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind Lars of all the times he had been mocked. He simply said, "Come inside. Get warm. Then I'll show you." They descended into the tunnel together, Bjorn with a lantern, Lars following behind. The passage was narrow, but surprisingly comfortable. The earthen walls seemed to embrace them, and the air grew warmer with every step. Lars had expected a hole in the ground, damp, dark, unpleasant. What he found instead was almost cozy. The walls had been carefully smoothed, the ceiling supported by sturdy timber beams. The floor was packed earth, dry and solid underfoot. Oil lamps hung at regular intervals, casting a warm golden glow. "You built this yourself?" Lars asked, his voice hushed with reluctant admiration. "With my son's help. Took us 46 days. 46 days of digging while the rest of us were gathering firewood." "Yes." Lars was silent for a moment. "We thought you were crazy." "I know. We laughed at you. I know that too." They continued deeper into the earth. The temperature rose steadily, from the bitter cold of the surface to something approaching comfortable. Lars shed his heavy coat, then his hat. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. "It's warm down here," he said, stating the obvious because his mind couldn't quite process what he was experiencing. 55 degrees, Bjorn replied. "Year-round, give or take. The earth doesn't care what the weather is doing on the surface. 6 feet down, it stays the same. My grandmother taught me that." "Your grandmother?" "She was from Norway. The old country, the old ways." Bjorn paused at a junction in the tunnel. "She used to say that modern people had forgotten things that ancient people understood instinctively. We think we're smarter than our ancestors, but sometimes the old knowledge is the best knowledge." At the end of the tunnel, in the underground smokehouse chamber, a small fire burned in the center of the stone-lined pit. It was barely more than embers, enough to produce smoke for preserving meat, but nothing that would seem capable of heating a home. "This is it?" Lars asked, incredulous. "This tiny fire? Feel the walls!" Lars pressed his hand against the stone. It was warm, not just room temperature, warm, like a sun-baked rock in summer. The fire heats the stones heat the earth heats the tunnel, and the tunnel heats the cabin. Bjorn pointed toward the ceiling, where the smoke rose through a carefully angled vent. The heat doesn't escape into the cold air. It travels through the ground, warming everything it touches. By the time the smoke reaches the surface, most of its heat has already been captured. But the fire is so small. The earth does most of the work. The fire just reminds it to stay warm. Bjorn smiled slightly. "My grandmother used to say that. I didn't understand until now." Lars was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with something that might have been shame. "I called you a fool. I laughed at you." "You did?" "I was wrong." "You were." "Can you teach me how to build this?" Bjorn looked at Lars Thorvaldsen, this man who had mocked him, who had predicted his death, who had tried to convince others that the Norwegian was crazy. He could have turned him away. He could have let pride have its moment. Instead, he said what his grandmother would have said. "Come upstairs. Bring your family. We'll wait out the storm together. And when spring comes, we'll dig." The storm lasted 9 days. The Thorvaldsens moved into the Halvorsen cabin on day 5, and stayed until day 10. It was crowded, 2 families in a space built for one, but it was warm. The children played together while the adults talked about tunnels and smokehouse design and the strange wisdom of a grandmother who had died 10 years before any of them were born. When the storm finally broke, Lars Thorvaldsen went home to find his cabin half destroyed, his livestock frozen, his savings gone. But he was alive. His family was alive, and he had a plan. That spring, 8 families dug tunnels. The winter of 1892 had broken something in the community, the stubborn independence that had brought them all to this harsh land in the first place. They had learned, at terrible cost, that survival required cooperation. That pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Lars Thorvaldsen's was the first. The man who had laughed loudest at Bjorn's tunnel became its most passionate advocate. He stood up at the town meeting in March and told everyone what he had seen: the warm cabin, the barely touched woodpile, the children playing comfortably while his own family nearly froze. "I was a fool," Lars said, his voice carrying through the packed church hall. "I mocked a man who was trying to save his family because I couldn't see past my own assumptions. 4 families died this winter, 16 people. They might be alive if I had listened instead of laughed." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Bjorn Halvorsen offered to teach me what he knows. He offered the same to anyone who wants to learn. I suggest we take him up on it." Lars Thorvaldsen started digging on March 15th as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig, and had his system operational by mid-October. His design was similar to Bjorn's, but modified for his family's needs: a longer tunnel, a larger smokehouse chamber, better ventilation. The others followed, the Magnussons, grieving their father, but determined to survive, the Carlsons from 3 miles east, the Hendricksons and the Bergs and the Nielsens. Each tunnel was slightly different, adapted to local conditions and individual needs, but they all followed the same basic principle: use the earth itself as a heat sink and radiator, capturing warmth from a small fire and distributing it through the ground. By the winter of 1893, 9 families in the settlement had underground heating systems. By 1895, 22 families. By 1900, there wasn't a homestead within 50 miles that didn't have some version of Bjorn Halvorsen's Smokehouse tunnel. In the summer of 1897, a professor from the University of Minnesota named Dr. Henrik Sorensen traveled to Dakota to study the phenomenon. He had heard rumors of a settlement where families survived the harshest winters with minimal fuel, and he wanted to understand the science behind it. Dr. Sorensen was a physicist by training, a Norwegian American by birth, and a skeptic by temperament. He had spent his career debunking folk remedies and old wives' tales, the kind of traditional knowledge that was often passed down through generations, but rarely held up to scientific scrutiny. He expected to find some simple explanation for the Halvorsen settlement success. Better insulated cabins, perhaps, or a naturally sheltered location. Maybe just exaggeration. Stories that had grown taller with each retelling, as stories often do. What he found amazed him. On his first morning in the settlement, Bjorn Halvorsen led him down into the underground tunnel. The professor brought his instruments: thermometers, barometers, devices for measuring humidity and airflow. He was prepared to take careful measurements and write a thorough debunking. Instead, He spent 3 weeks underground, filling notebook after notebook with calculations and observations. "This is remarkable," he kept muttering to himself. "This shouldn't work as well as it does. The efficiency is impossible." But it wasn't impossible. It was just unexpected. The combination of factors, the constant earth temperature, the thermal mass of the stone walls, the careful channeling of smoke and heat, created a system that was far more effective than any contemporary heating technology. When Dr. Sorensen calculated the BTU transfer rates, he found that Bjorn's Smokehouse tunnel was more efficient than the coal-fired furnaces being installed in wealthy homes back east. The Norwegian immigrant, working with shovels and pickaxes and ancestral knowledge, had independently invented something that modern engineers were just beginning to understand. What he found amazed him. "The genius of this system," he wrote in his subsequent report, "lies in its use of the Earth's natural thermal mass. At a depth of 6 feet, soil temperature remains nearly constant year-round, approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit in this region. By channeling heat from a small fire through underground passages, these settlers have created what is essentially a primitive geothermal heating system. The Earth itself serves as both insulator and radiator, absorbing excess heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. The efficiency is remarkable. Fuel consumption reduced by as much as 80% compared to conventional heating methods. Dr. Sorensen spent 3 weeks in the settlement, interviewing families, measuring temperatures, documenting construction techniques. He published his findings in the American Journal of Agricultural Science, where they were read by approximately 47 people before being forgotten. The settlers didn't need the validation. They knew what worked. Bjorn Halvorsen lived until 1924. He was 67 years old when he died, not from cold, but from a heart that simply wore out after a lifetime of hard work. Ingrid had passed 3 years earlier. They had been married for 46 years and never spent more than a week apart. His children carried on the farm. But more than that, they carried on his legacy. Magnus became an engineer, studying at the University of Minnesota on a scholarship that Dr. Sorensen had helped arrange. The professor had never forgotten the boy who had carried buckets of dirt while his father invented something remarkable, and he made sure Magnus had opportunities that most farm children could only dream of. At university, Magnus studied the science behind his father's intuition. He learned the physics of heat transfer, the mathematics of thermal mass, the engineering principles that could transform ancestral wisdom into reproducible technology. His senior thesis, Traditional Heating Methods of the Northern Plains, a scientific analysis, became a minor classic in the field of heating engineering. He could have stayed in the city. He had job offers from companies across the country, firms that wanted someone who understood both the old ways and the new. Instead, he returned to Dakota. "The land needs people who understand it," he told a confused professor who tried to convince him to pursue an academic career. "The knowledge needs to stay close to its roots." Magnus spent the rest of his life improving and refining his father's design. He experimented with different tunnel configurations, different stone arrangements, different methods of channeling heat. He documented everything in careful notebooks that would eventually find their way into university archives, where future researchers would marvel at the systematic rigor of a self-taught farm engineer. Astrid took a different path. She married a farmer from the next county, a good man named Johannes, who had been one of the first to adopt the Halvorsen heating system. Together, they raised 7 children on a homestead that featured the largest and most sophisticated underground heating network in the territory. But Astrid's greatest legacy was cultural, not technical. She became the keeper of the stories, the woman who remembered everything about those early years. She could recite from memory the names of every family who had died in the winter of 1892. She knew the exact words her grandmother had spoken about the earth being a blanket. She could describe in vivid detail the look on Lars Thorvaldsen's face when he finally understood what Bjorn had built. She taught each of her children the song she had sung as a girl while her father dug in the cold earth, and when those children had children of their own, she taught them too. The original tunnel is still there. But before we reach the end, there's one more chapter to tell. The chapter about what happened to Bjorn Halvorsen himself, the man who trusted his grandmother's wisdom when everyone else called him a fool. In 1897, at the age of 42, Bjorn received a letter from the territorial government. The Department of Agriculture had heard about his underground heating system. They wanted to send an inspector to evaluate whether it could be recommended as standard practice for frontier homesteads. The inspector who arrived that spring was a young man named Thomas Whitfield, fresh from college back east, full of theories about scientific agriculture and modern building practices. He came expecting to debunk a folk legend. What he found changed his career. Whitfield spent 3 days at the Halvorsen homestead, measuring temperatures in the tunnels, examining the construction techniques, interviewing Bjorn about the system's performance. His report, submitted to the department that summer, ran to 47 pages. The system, developed by Mr. Halvorsen, he wrote, represents a genuine innovation in cold climate heating. While the theoretical principles have been understood by scientists for some years, the practical application demonstrated here exceeds anything I have encountered in either academic literature or professional practice. The report recommended that the territorial government fund a demonstration project, a larger version of Bjorn's system that could be studied scientifically and potentially replicated across the region. The funding was approved in 1898. The demonstration project was built on a farm 20 miles from the Halvorsen homestead, using techniques that Bjorn himself supervised. It worked exactly as well as the original, but Bjorn was never comfortable with the attention. When newspapers began writing about the Norwegian heating revolution and reporters came to interview the immigrant inventor of Dakota, he retreated into his work. He expanded his fields, improved his tunnels, taught his children everything he knew. "I didn't invent anything," he told one persistent journalist. "I just remembered what my grandmother taught me. She's the one who deserved the credit." The journalist, of course, didn't include that quote in his article. It didn't fit the narrative he wanted to tell, the story of a brave immigrant who triumphed through American ingenuity. The Norwegian grandmother, the ancient wisdom, the centuries of knowledge passed down through generations, none of that made it into print. Bjorn learned to stop reading the newspaper articles. They never got the story right anyway. In the summer of 1903, Bjorn traveled back to Norway for the first and only time since his departure 22 years earlier. The village of Ålesund had changed. New buildings had replaced some of the old ones. The harbor had been expanded. A few of the families he remembered had prospered, others had moved away or died out. But some things remained the same. Bjorn visited his grandmother's grave, a simple marker in the village churchyard, weathered by decades of rain and salt air. He knelt in the grass and talked to her, telling her about Dakota, about the tunnels, about the families he had saved. He told her about the night he had sat in his unheated cabin, ready to give up, when her voice had come back to him. The earth is a blanket. The soil remembers summer. You saved us, Bestamore, he said to the stone. Not me, you. He stayed in Norway for 3 months, reconnecting with distant cousins, visiting the places he had known as a child. On his last day, he walked out to the hillside where his grandmother had taken him 50 years before, the place where she had first taught him to feel the earth's warmth. The hill was unchanged. The soil was still warm beneath the surface. The lesson was still true. Bjorn returned to Dakota that fall, carrying a small glass jar filled with Norwegian earth, soil from the hillside where his grandmother had taught him the secret of survival. He buried that jar beneath the entrance to his main heating tunnel, where it remains to this day. A piece of home, he told Marta when she asked about it. A piece of her. Bjorn Halvorsen died in 1918, during the great influenza epidemic that swept across the world in the final year of World War I. He was 63 years old. His death was mourned throughout the county. The local newspaper, the same one that had mocked his Smokehouse project 3 decades earlier, published a full-page obituary describing him as one of the most innovative and respected members of our community. The obituary said nothing about the neighbors who had laughed at him, nothing about the cold nights of doubt and desperation, nothing about the immigrant grandmother whose wisdom had made it all possible. But Marta made sure the true story was preserved. She wrote it all down in a leather journal that she kept until her own death in 1934. That journal passed to Magnus, then to his daughter, then to her son, a lineage of remembering that continues to this day. The last entry in Marta's journal, written on the day of Bjorn's funeral, captures everything that mattered. They buried him today in the Lutheran cemetery next to the graves of the Hansen children who froze in the winter of '92. The pastor spoke of hard work and faith and the American dream. But I know the truth. Bjorn survived because he listened. He listened to an old woman who understood things that educated men had forgotten. He trusted the wisdom of his ancestors when everyone around him told him he was wrong. And he passed that wisdom on to his children just as she passed it to him. That is his legacy. That is what mattered. The cabin was rebuilt in 1932, replaced by a modern farmhouse with electric heating and indoor plumbing. But beneath that farmhouse, if you know where to look, you can find the entrance to a passage that was dug more than a century ago by a Norwegian immigrant who remembered his grandmother's words. The stones in the smokehouse chamber are still warm. Today, engineers call this principle earth-coupled heating, or ground source thermal mass. It's the basis for geothermal heat pumps, which are now installed in millions of homes worldwide. The modern systems are more sophisticated, of course, using electric compressors and circulating fluids and computer-controlled thermostats. But the fundamental insight is exactly the same. The earth stays warm when the air turns cold. And if you know how to tap into that warmth, you can heat your home with a fraction of the energy. The first commercial geothermal heat pump was installed in 1948. By 2020, there were more than 1.7 million of them in the United States alone. Each one saves its owner hundreds of dollars in heating costs each year. Each one reduces carbon emissions. Each one makes the world a slightly better place. The engineers who designed these systems would never know the name Bjorn Halvorsen. They would never hear the phrase, "The earth is a blanket." They would never understand that the technology they patented and sold had been invented, in its essential form, by an elderly woman in a Norwegian fishing village more than a century before. But Bjorn knew. And he made sure his children knew, and they made sure their children knew. A billion-dollar industry built on an idea that an illiterate Norwegian grandmother understood intuitively in 1850. In the village of Alesund, Norway, they still tell stories about Sigrid Halvorsen, the woman who lived to be 96 years old, who survived 3 famines and 2 plagues, who kept her family warm through winters that killed her neighbors. The stories have changed over the years, as stories do. Some versions make her a witch, someone who communed with the spirits of the earth. Others make her a saint, blessed by God with special knowledge. A few tell it straight. An old woman who paid attention to the world around her and learned things that others missed. But all the versions agree on the essential point. She knew something important, something valuable, something worth passing down. When the German army occupied Norway during World War II, the village elders hid their most precious historical documents in an underground cellar, built, according to family tradition, using techniques that Sigrid herself had designed. The documents survived the occupation, the bombing, the years of hardship that followed. The earth protected them, the village historian wrote in 1947, just as Sigrid said it would. Her great-great-great-grandson still lives in that village. He runs a heating company that specializes in geothermal systems. In his office, there's a photograph of a tunnel in Dakota Territory, dug by a man he never met, but knows through stories passed down through 5 generations. And if you ask him about the secret of staying warm, he'll tell you what his grandmother told him and what her grandmother told her. The earth is a blanket. The soil remembers summer. You just have to know how to ask. Sometimes the people who know most about surviving the impossible are the ones nobody thinks to ask. The old ones, the immigrants, the grandmothers with weathered hands and ancient wisdom. We live in a world that worships the new technology, new ideas, new solutions to old problems. We look forward so constantly that we forget to look back. But there is wisdom in the past. There is knowledge encoded in the traditions our ancestors kept, the stories they told, the practices they maintained for generations without fully understanding why. The earth is a blanket. This is what Sigrid knew. This is what Bjorn learned. This is what their descendants still remember, even as they drive electric cars and check their smartphones and live in heated houses that would have seemed like magic to the Norwegian fishermen of 1850. Somewhere deep in the ground beneath a Dakota farmstead, the stones that Bjorn Halvorsen placed 130 years ago are still warm. Somewhere in Norway, an old man is telling his grandchildren about a woman named Sigrid, who understood things that scientists are only now beginning to rediscover. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is dismissing their grandmother's advice as old-fashioned nonsense. They might want to reconsider. They've seen things we can't imagine. They've learned lessons that our modern world has forgotten. And if we're smart, if we're humble enough to listen, they might just teach us how to survive, too. What wisdom did your grandparents pass down to you? What skills did they have that you wish you'd learned? Drop a comment below and share their stories, because sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes from the people who came before us. And if you want to hear more stories about forgotten wisdom and survival, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got stories that will change the way you think about the past. Until next time, stay curious, honor those who came before, and never underestimate the wisdom hiding in your own family history.